you really have to, while the other person is talking, you have to really get lost in them, and what they're saying, what they might be feeling. If the stakes are truly high, it's worth spending time doing that.
From humble beginnings, Insurance Claim HQ has grown to one of the largest property casualty firms in the country. We didn't do it alone, and you shouldn't either. Every week, we're talking to claims professionals and top experts from all over, all to help you grow your business and make you stronger. Let's level up together. I'm Galen Hair. Welcome to the Level Up Claims Podcast. Communication can make or break anything. Trust, leadership, negotiations, culture, and even the outcome of major decisions. But a lot of professionals confuse executive presence with being the loudest person in the room, when in reality, the best leaders often communicate with the clarity, calmness, and intentionality that this situation deserves. Today's guest, Eric Nitzberg, has spent more than 2 decades coaching CEOs and senior executives through high-stakes business challenges, leadership pressure, and organizational complexity. From teaching executive presence and storytelling at Stanford Graduate School of Business to advising leaders of Fortune 100 and hyper-growth companies, Eric helps people lead with more confidence, self-awareness, and impact. Let's jump in. Eric, thank you so much for joining us.
Galen, my pleasure. Good to talk to you.
So, I come today with an admission to make, not so much to you, but to the rest of the listeners, because I guess it doesn't really matter to you. I have been dilatory in my obligations as a host of this podcast over the last couple of years. We have talked about marketing. We've talked a lot about insurance claims, engineering, legislation. We've talked a lot about leadership generally. We've even talked about communication, and we've talked about AI and tech like ad nauseum. Something we have never really talked about specifically is leadership communication, and what that really means and how to do that. So, I guess I don't have to apologize to you because I'm fixing that problem right now. But I do owe the listeners an apology because you would think in 2 years I would have prioritized this topic earlier. So I'm going to kind of do reverse. I always get to know you first, and we're going to do that. But why don't you explain briefly what leadership communication really is and why it's so important?
Sure. Well, leadership communication is really everything that's involved in, as you might expect, communicating when you're in a leadership position. And that breaks down into both the talking side and also the listening side. And when I think about the talking side, it really has to do with how well do you know your audience, first of all? And then how clear are you on the goals that you have for your communication? And then what messaging is going to help you accomplish those goals for that audience? So it really is a kind of strategic approach to communication. I think a lot of folks just kind of dive in to whatever communication they have an important conversation, so they're like, okay, I'm going to go do it. But really, a lot of the strategy aspect of leadership communication is about how you prepare.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, so let's take a couple of steps back, because I imagine Eric Nitzberg as a baby, well, that's too young. I guess Eric Nitzberg in 2nd grade did not tell his teachers, I want to be a leadership communication professional, right? So how did we end up here?
That is true. That is true. I was not in my mother's arms thinking leadership coaching.
Were you like, oh, she just sucks at this? She's my leader. She needs to be better.
If my family could only communicate better, the world would be better. Right? Said baby Eric. No, I have had a very windy path on my career. I went to college as a Chinese language and literature major. So I went to college as an undeclared major, even worse. And then I was a liberal arts guy, Chinese language, which I thought was a brilliant idea until I started thinking about jobs. And then fairly soon after college, I ended up working in the ministry. So I was a pastor and then eventually an executive leader in a church here in Silicon Valley. And I did that for about a dozen years. So I had that background doing a lot of public speaking and a lot of communicating with a lot of different kinds of people. And then I kind of got burned out on that, and I was looking for something new to do. This is the condensed version, but I was looking for something new to do, and I just kind of fell into coaching. I didn't even realize it was a whole industry when I started. But and then my first client was, we happened to have the leader of the Stanford Graduate School of Business Communication program in our church. So my first client was Stanford Business School, one of my first clients, and so that was got me off to a good start in that career.
I should imagine that that would be a good, yeah, no one talks about the coaching as like a business industry, but it is massive. I mean,
Billions
sometimes
of dollars.
oh yeah, sometimes I feel like there's a coach for every person, you know? Um,
There is now. Yeah.
and more popping up every day. However, some of them are fantastic, and I think they serve a really important purpose because it's such an interesting idea. You know, we rely on coaches the entire time we're growing up, and then we become these business owners, and half of us say, okay, I can do it all myself. And we've never done that traditionally in our entire life. You do the work yourself. The coach doesn't do the work for you, but the coach shows you how to do the work, right? And what decisions to make. So I think it's interesting coming from the faith background, right? Because you're obviously up in front of a lot of people regularly. But I think the difference, unless you're going to tell me I'm wrong, is when you're a faith leader, you're kind of branded with an air of leadership, right? Um, Church mutinies can happen, but they don't happen often, right? We typically accept our faith leader as our faith leader. I understand there's politics and there's promotions, and depending on, especially on the specific religion and the sect within that religion, there's a whole variety of issues to deal with, right? But for the average person sitting in the pew, that person in front of them is the person that God selected to be their faith leader, right? We don't have that curse or blessing, depending on how you look at it, when we walk into a company. We have to, I think, even if we own the company and we're the founder of the company, there will be people within there that will constantly question whether we are the suitable people to be leading that company. That's at least how I feel. What's been your experience as you've kind of transitioned into helping these corporate leaders with their communication and leadership style, as far as the challenges that they face from within?
Well, I do think that credibility is one of the foundations of successful leadership, and it comes from a lot of places. One of them has to do with your competency. You know, how effective are you as a leader, as a communicator? Um, but actually, I think it is some of the softer skills that also matter a lot. There's a huge study of leadership over several decades, one of the bigger ones, that found that more than anything else, what people are looking for from their leaders is honesty. And I know that in this day and age, that may kind of ring a little bit hollow, because we see, you know, there's examples of very public leaders who seem to be not maybe so honest. But
I can't imagine who you're talking about. Keep going. You're fine.
that said, really more than anything else, and that is across industries and across cultures globally, different size companies, people really want it's even more important than intelligence. People want honesty more than they even want smarts. And so I think the basics of character actually really do matter in successful leadership. You know, and then beyond that, I think people also want to know that you actually care about them. One of my favorite authors, who's a leadership author, has in the signature line of his email, it says, "Love them and lead them." And I think there really is something to that. People want to work for somebody that they think actually cares about them.
So we're going to get to the actual topic that we're here to discuss in a second, but I want to dig into that because now you've got my wheels turning. So the timing of this could not be more interesting, because last night I couldn't sleep. So I read a bunch of transcripts of a series of ongoing lawsuits. The specific details are irrelevant, but it's very pertinent to my industry. It's a law firm that does the work that I do, or did the work that I do, and they went under. And they went under through, I would call it, a series of just absolutely abusively incompetent leadership. However, so anyway, because it's a law firm, various disciplinary authorities, including courts, got involved. So there were these hearings with all these lawyers that work there to find out why they should or should not be suspended, stay suspended, what should happen with their licenses, right? Don't even ask me why I started looking these up last night, because I have no answer, but I did. And one of the things that came back over and over and over is, oh, we just believed the leaders that everything was okay and nothing was wrong. And I gotta say, then when you said, oh, are people really just want honesty? And then you made the kind of joke about political current events. Like, I actually thought to myself, well, you've got to be wrong about that, because it seems like, honestly, people just crave someone that's willing to lie and say exactly what they want to hear these days. So is that not the case within, like, I'm not about to pull all my employees in and start lying to them about ridiculous things, but I actually went to bed last night thinking maybe I'm doing it wrong. Maybe I should not be communicating openly and honestly with my team, because they seem to respond better. You know, literally, this fraudulent enterprise had hundreds of people loyally working for it until they got shut down, you know? And what they all said is, well, they just made it sound good. So, like, does it matter if I'm honest? Should I just make things sound good?
Well, I think you have your answer kind of embedded in your story that you just told, which is, they were shut down.
Well, I'm not going to
And
break the law. I'm just saying, do I have to tell truth to my people?
No, but I mean, look, I think that there is a lot of manipulation in the world, and a lot of dishonesty happens. But I think in the long term, those folks are found out for what they are. And, things happen like the firm that you mentioned that got shut down, essentially for fraud, for dishonesty. So I think that people get away with it for a while. And, unfortunately, folks are sometimes, frequently misled by a good sales pitch. But usually in a company, these are very long-term relationships, and there eventually comes a time where there's a price to pay in terms of trust when a leader is dishonest, and eventually they're found out. I mean, I know this is a complex topic, but I'm pretty clear in my own mind and heart, and when I'm advising leaders, if there's ever an ethical issue that comes up in our discussions, my answer is, you want to do the right thing. It's the
Yeah.
best thing in the long term. You'll have more engaged employees. You'll have the kind of employees that you want to have. Um, so I've landed pretty squarely uh, in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a comfortable fit, obviously, right? If you behave ethically in what you believe to be morally, understandably, with everyone having slightly different sets of those, there's still some pretty universal truths as to what you can and can't do. If
Yeah.
you do that and you make your leadership decisions that way and you communicate that way, I mean, it's going to be hard to say you were wrong. Maybe you could make some improvements in terms of the way you communicate or how you communicate, but you're not going to be fundamentally at odds with like what we expect, right?
Now, I will say that within that, there is some nuance, which is it is also a leader's job to inspire the people that they lead, to paint a picture of an inspiring vision. Here's where we're all going together. Here's the great stuff we're going to achieve together. And so I've worked with leaders. I can think of one example in particular where the leader I was working with thought, "Gosh, I'm just going to be honest," and so he kind of spread all of this negativity about what was going on with the company very openly and honestly, but without giving people hope. And I really do think you need to do both. I mean, it's good to be candid, but you also need to combine that with, if you've got bad news to deliver, you need to combine it, give people a ladder to climb out, climb up out of that with. Here's where we are now. It's not great, but I'm hopeful for the future for these reasons. And here's what we're doing about it. I think that's also part of leadership. It's not, you can't just leave people in a painful truth.
I agree with that. So one of the things that strikes me, right? So I'm in this like entrepreneurs organization, not EO. Sorry, I just used the words. But but I'm in it and we get together about once a year and they invest, and these people are very successful, right? Very good at what they do. Not necessarily me, but I did somehow trick them into letting me in. Um, but they spend an ungodly amount of time leading up to the get together, which is like 4 days. And even the first few hours of the get together addressing imposter syndrome. And then I was kind of listening to some of your podcasts, listening to some of your discussions, interviews you've given, right? And you said something that really resonated with me, which is you said that like high performers struggle internally more than people realize. And I was like, well, this is it, right? All these super successful entrepreneurs in a room, and yet they're dedicating like weeks ahead of time to telling you, hey, you're going to feel inadequate when you get here. Don't. Like that for me was like my aha moment. Like what you're saying is absolutely true. But why is it that you think these high performers struggle internally?
I think one of the reasons is that they are constantly facing new challenges. So the feelings of imposter syndrome, I'm not sure if I can do this. Some people are going to find out I'm a fake. However those feelings emerge for people, they don't come from nowhere. They come when you're climbing a mountain you've never climbed before. They come because you're trying to do something that's really hard. And people who are very ambitious and who are trying to grow companies are constantly doing things they've never done before, doing things that are really challenging. If you just kind of find a comfortable spot and stay in the same role for many years, you may have some challenges that come your way, but it's not going to be like what you encounter when you're the CEO of a growing company. And so that's why there was a study a couple of years ago that found that imposter syndrome, the occurrence rate among like regular kind of average employees, I think was something like 20 or 30%. Senior executives, it was in 65%, and CEOs, it was 70%. So the more senior you are, the more likely it is that you're going to experience that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I suffer from it. I think all of us do.
I
So,
do.
well, that's relieving to hear because honestly, I assumed you didn't. Um,
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, and imposter syndrome, it's not something that you experience all the time, right? It's something that you experience situationally. So there was a period for me, oh gosh, maybe 8, 10 years ago, and it certainly happened since then as well, but there was one, like, really intense period for me where I was coaching at a big company. They were giving me lots of business, very famous, big company, and, I felt for about 2 years, I had this persistent feeling like, "I'm not good enough at this. I have to get better. How can I get better in order to coach these amazing, like, world-class leaders?" And I would go into like every sales meeting, every meeting, I was like, "Okay, how can I, do better? Because I don't think I'm good enough at this." And that was actually extremely productive for me. Like, it's uncomfortable, but there's a lot of value in that because I forced myself to get better and to grow. And, after 2 or 3 years, I guess I had less of those feelings, but they still come up, if I'm facing a new challenge.
yeah, that makes complete sense to me. So let's talk about presence or executive presence, as you would term it. Um, but first, the segue there, right, is that, we talked a little about imposter syndrome, and I think that's an interesting myth, or maybe it's truth. You'll tell me. One of the things people say is, oh, you just have to have more presence. Like you can get over your self doubt by just having presence. But so I guess my question is like, that's probably not true. But all that aside,
It's not.
what does executive presence really mean and why is it important? And what should we be thinking about as leaders within our own organizations when it comes to executive presence?
Yeah, when you really boil it down, executive presence is about effective communication, and specifically communication that is effective or helps you achieve your goals in a very specific context that you're facing. So it actually can mean a lot of different things depending on the situation. If you're in a situation where let's say you've got a really angry customer and you're trying to navigate that, it could mean good listening. It could mean staying calm in the face of a big storm, and a lot of emotion. If you are standing in front of your company, you've got 20 people or 50 people or whatever, and you're trying to inspire them, then executive presence might look like good public speaking and painting a picture of a positive vision for the future. So it really depends, but the common ground on defining it is really it's what is effective, what's going to achieve your goals for that situation.
Okay. So when I was younger, I was made to understand from like debate and speech class, right? That presence was being very confident while I talked, talking very clearly, and often raising my voice. I didn't hear you say that. So I'm assuming that is not the case, but can you explain why that's not like does we were always told project confidence, that is presence, right? Is that not true?
I was in debate too, by the way. I'm just reflecting on Mr. Treadway, our high school debate teacher, who was great. It was a great, sort of life changing to be in high school debate. Um, but to answer your question, I think there are situations where showing up and projecting confidence is what executive presence looks like. It's just that's not what's needed in every situation. So that could be in a situation where it's more confrontational. For example, you've got a potential high conflict situation. You're going into a negotiation. You might want to show up with a little more backbone. A little more because you don't want your a counterpart to smell blood in the water. If you're kind of hunched over and your voice is really quiet and you're looking away and that's not going to help you in your
Yeah.
negotiation. So, but there could be another situation. Let's say you're giving feedback to an employee. You've got an employee who's struggling and you want to give them some constructive feedback to help them get better. Well, I don't think it's going to necessarily help to show up, as the master of the universe with your booming voice and you probably want to be a little bit more collaborative and a little bit more of a peer to that employee, so you can get through to them. They know that you're giving them this hard feedback because you care about them. And so again, it's situational, and I think that's probably my most universal advice to people about communication. If it's important, prepare for it. Spend some time in advance thinking about, okay, who's my audience? Who am I talking to? And how do I want to show up for this interaction to make it go well? There's no one rule that applies to every interaction for communication.
Well, that's what I wanted you to do is give us the rule.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, the rule, that is the one rule. If it's important, prepare for it. Really think about it. How
okay.
do I need to show up for this? And actually, if the stakes are really high, I even recommend people like rehearse a little bit out loud. How am I going to say it? Today you can use an AI to do that. You can put in a prompt for an AI and tell it, hey, I want a verbal conversation. I want to do a role play, and here's the situation, and I want to practice this before I do it. If the stakes are truly high, it's worth spending time doing that.
That's interesting. Now, let me think about how I want to word this. So, I would assume at least that leaders unintentionally lose influence through poor communication habits. And so if my
Absolutely.
okay, well, good. I do get things right sometimes. Um, but
Much of
what
the
are some
time.
I wish. Ask my girlfriend and she will tell you very rarely. However, I guess what are some of those bad habits though that cause us to kind of unintentionally lose influence?
Influence in relationships is a lot about listening. And so one of the mistakes people make is just to talk and just only talk. Talk too much, talk about yourself, just keep talking. And eventually you'll start losing influence because it's a two-way street. Um, but I think that's one of the mistakes that people make. Some of the other basics are make eye contact, some about your facial expressions. Are you a natural communicator? Some people, when they're communicating and the stakes are high, they go into kind of a performance mode where they kind of change into a different person. They go into like speech mode. I'm going to give a speech now, so I become this different person. That usually doesn't work. I think even for more formal communication, it's better to communicate like you're having a conversation rather than like you're giving a performance.
Fair.
So I think authenticity is really important in communication. So anything that where you show up and you're not you, I think that can be a problem.
Okay. That that all makes a lot of sense, honestly. So I guess the question becomes, like, how do you show up as that person, right? So the listening I get, I actually really do, and I think a lot of people don't. Um, and my example that I like to give is you just gave a very thoughtful answer with about 7 different parts. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's good. But what people tend to do is listen to the very first part and then start to formulate their response so they can sound smart, right? And then, especially in a public venue like this, where later people will get to hear what we said. But even in one-on-one discussions, if I have a goal or an aim, dating is like the best example, right? How many times have you been on a date, and you ask that person a question and then you start thinking about what you're going to say back to sound interesting, and you miss
Yeah.
the whole part of it. And that sometimes leads to really awkward moments where if you listen to the whole story, you were going to find out that she was really telling a story about how her mother died. Instead, he said, "Oh, that's really interesting. I love Disney." Um, but I've never
Is
done
that a
that.
personal
Although,
experience you've had yourself?
no, I've heard. I have a friend who did that and didn't understand why she didn't want to go on a second date. But I always say that there's listening and there's being quiet while you wait for your turn to talk, and that those are not the same things. And you gave a very thoughtful answer, but all of it to me feels amorphous, right? So I guess what I'm asking is that, are there any exercises? Are there any kind of fence posts, something tangible that, obviously you're not going to listen to this podcast, leave and become an expert communicator with perfect executive presence. I do not expect that. And I don't expect you could give us that on this podcast. But is there anything kind of tangible that I could take away and say, here's an exercise I can do or something I can actively work on to try to move towards that? Because you listed at least 7 or 8 qualities of a good leader in terms of communication, and I think they're all true. But if I sit there thinking about all of them the whole time I'm talking, I imagine I'm not going to speak effectively either.
Well, so let's go into listening a little bit more because I think there's some really concrete, practical things that people could do right away to become better listeners. So one is you can't really talk and listen at the same time. So if you're a talker, try to talk less. That's one
Fair?
thing you can do. Another thing that you can do is remember that listening, you might think that you're listening, but what really matters is, does the other person think that you're listening? So you have to prove to them that you're listening. And so one way to do that is after you've let them talk for a while, before you say whatever clever thing you've teed up in your brain to say, is to try to paraphrase back just briefly what you just heard. And so, it sounds like this. Hey, what I hear you saying, it sounds like you're very frustrated that, your house just burned down and you don't know what to do and you're scared. Did I get that right? Okay, that's a horrible example, but you're just saying very briefly, like a summary of what they've said, maybe summarize the emotion back to them. The reason that that's so important is it provides them evidence that you were listening.
I'm smiling, sorry. And now
I
you're
see
looking at
that
me
and I'm
weird.
wondering why.
I was trying not to just say the next clever thing I had to think about. But
Good job.
I'm smiling because what you said was paraphrase back what they told you. And what you did was you mirrored back the emotions that the person intended to convey or didn't intend to convey, but were experiencing, which are not the same thing. And yet is something that trial lawyers, the best trial lawyers in the country, have been attempting to perfect for most of their careers, is not worrying about paraphrasing the facts, but capturing and mirroring back the emotion in order for the jury to understand where that person telling their story is really coming from. And it was very interesting because that's one of the exercises they do is they have you sit and talk to someone, and instead of telling them back what they heard, they tell them back how they feel. Not how I feel listening to your story, how I think you feel telling your story.
It's very powerful, I think, if you can do both, because it shows the other person that you really got them. Like, I've
Yeah.
really got it. You paraphrase back the facts in a really dry way, that helps. But if you can also say, yeah, and it seems like you're really angry about this, or you're really frustrated about this, then they can relax a little bit because they feel like, okay, this they've got me. They understand what's actually happening here. In order to do that, of course, when the other person's talking, you have to really pay attention so that you can detect what they're actually feeling. And that is harder to do if you, like you were saying before, if you're queuing up your next comment in your mind, you really have to, while the other person is talking, you have to really get lost in them, and what they're saying, what they might be feeling, and just trust that when they're done talking, you're going to be able to figure out what to say.
Yeah.
But you're right, most people don't do that.
No, it's interesting. I didn't expect during our discussion today. It makes sense, right? Trial lawyers are in the business of communication, but I did not expect there to be overlap from one of kind of your central theses with trial practice, and that was maybe a miscalculation on my part. So
Yeah, interesting.
I feel a little silly in retrospect. I'm not kicking myself. I just feel silly. Um, and it's so interesting because at the end of the day, all I do as a lawyer is communicate. Yet I did not think you would today essentially pair it back with some of the best trial attorneys that have ever lived have perfected. Um,
Interesting.
I'm thinking of like Jerry Spence. He started the movement of what they call psychodrama, but really consists of capturing emotions through conversation. Um, all right, sorry, I'm a little out of sorts at the moment, but I can admit that. So let me get back to let's
No
get back.
problem.
Um, man, I'm just gonna get all these great tools now for trial practice going forward. I wanted to talk about the flip side. You gave us I asked you for some concrete examples. You said, let's take listening, and we got a really great one. And I hope you guys paid attention because it was really good. Because now I'm just going to go over time because I'm having fun. Um, I think there are some things that probably are not productive for executive presence and leadership communication, right? Such as over explaining, hedging, talking too much. But I think we do these as a defense mechanism, no? So if you agree with that, then what's the solution to get past that?
Well, I guess there's kind of two questions, like what do people do wrong, and then like what to
Yeah.
do about it. And when I think of communication, I think of body language is one. So what people get wrong there is they don't make eye contact, they look away, they're slumped over, they're shuffling on their feet. Those are some things that they get wrong there. Another aspect is voice, how people use their voice. So people talk too fast, they talk too soft. Occasionally people talk too loud. That's less common. A third area is the words that you choose. What are you actually saying? So there's like too many words. Talking too much is common. Occasionally there are people who just don't say anything. They need to actually be speaking up. And so they don't have executive presence. They're not effective because they're not really saying very much. And they need to be saying more. And then the fourth area I think of is authenticity. And where people get in trouble there is they're trying to fake it. And then people can tell, they're up to something. They're not being themselves. So I think if you want to get better, so your question was like why do we make mistakes in those areas? I think sometimes it's nervousness, but a lot of times it's just a lack of skill or a lack of practice. They haven't
Hmm.
been taught otherwise. They're just kind of communicating the way they always have. And, they've got the toolbox they came into the world with, and they haven't really expanded it. They haven't really, added new tools. So I think the way to work on it or to improve is to try to, I think the best way to improve communication is to do some practice, like rehearsing of a scenario, and to get feedback on your practice. And so like that's what I do in a coaching session if I'm coaching somebody on their communication is they'll have some, challenging communication thing coming up, and then they will role play it with me. So I'll play the part of the customer or the board member or the investor or whatever, and I'll try to grill them or throw them off, or and so they can practice over and over, and then I'll give them feedback and say, here's how I think you could do it better. Do this with your eye contact. Do this, you'll be more natural. Do that. I think that's the best way to improve. And if you don't want to hire a coach, you can make, like I said, you can make a lot of headway right now with an AI. Pick your favorite AI and put in a prompt that describes, I want you to be my communication coach. We're going to have a live conversation. Here's the person that I want you to play. Here's their personality. Here's the scenario. Ready, go. And give me feedback after we, do a few rounds. And the AIs today are not bad at that. That you could do a lot worse than spending a half an hour practicing a tough conversation with an AI before you actually do it. It's not perfect, but it's getting better all the time.
It's fascinating. So in a world of AI, because you've mentioned AI a couple of times now as a potential tool, and I think AI is a tool on so many things. But AI is changing everything, and we know this. Like how it's going to change things, no one's got a crystal ball. Everyone's guessing. But leadership communication in today's world with AI, where people are just typing in, hey, draft me an email to do this, draft me a statement for this. How do we merge those two worlds where, leadership communication has been intensely personal, even when they were company-wide emails. And now they're becoming less personal, right? Like the second I get an email from someone and I see all the dashes, I'm like, F you. Like I'm not even, I'm not even responding to this. This is such a waste of my time. And it may have come from a good place, right? In fact, this lovely young lady who summer clerks for us just said, hey, you never responded to my request to sponsor one of our events. Man, I felt terrible. I went back and found the email. She wrote it with AI. Her heart was in the right place. She said, hey, I really want my old boss to, my boss last summer to sponsor this event that my organization's putting on. And then she probably said, will you draft an email to him? But I saw it for AI communication and trashed it immediately. So I guess as leaders, how do we reconcile those two worlds? Like, as far as the importance of leadership communication and how we work with that within an AI world?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I do think in a world of like limitless instant writing, that's done for you, that again, authenticity is really what stands out. I don't know if you do much posting on LinkedIn or if you're engaged much on LinkedIn, but we've basically gone back to everything we post is going to be written by a human. We kind of tinkered a little bit with AI, and it's like, it just isn't authentic is the problem. It's writing has a voice, and so if you have an AI write for you, it may not come out as authentic. Or if you're going to use AI, the main thing is like, make sure that you are the editor. Like you have to agree with what it wrote. Otherwise you're just totally giving up your responsibility for the communication. So I think that's important too. But I guess my advice to people would be, I do think you need to use AI. I think we all need to learn how to use AI at as high a level as we can, because it is the new tool set. It's sort of like if you're not using AI, you're like a contractor who decided never to use power tools. And there are some of those, and that's okay, but that's a very niche business now. Like you're not going to make a living that way, for most contractors. So I think AI is like that for like white collar, thinking work. And so you have to use it. But again, think about how you're using it. So is it an important communication? Maybe you want to write that yourself. Or at least go back through the draft from the AI and make it sound like you, spend the extra minute or two and make it sound like you. So I think it's incredibly useful, and I think it has its downsides, and you have to manage those.
I couldn't agree more. Eric, you've been super generous with your time, massively generous, and I appreciate you. You've given us a lot to think about. Before we do wrap this up, though, I've got to ask you what it means to you to level up.
I think for the topic we're talking about, communication, leveling up means preparing. You look out over your week, you think about which of these conversations this week are going to be the top 5% most important. There's one or two or three conversations that really, really matter. You set aside the time and you prepare for those conversations, and you will level up.
I could not agree more. Eric, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Galen. It's really been a pleasure chatting with you.
I'd like to thank Eric Nitzberg for joining us on the show. I don't think there's anyone in our entire industry that would think that communication is not an important, fundamental tool. But there is a difference between communicating with an adverse party, like an insurance carrier, and being a leadership communicator with our own teams. You heard it from Eric. Focus on the things that matter. Be prepared. Be ready to have the difficult conversations and actually listen to the other side. When you do these little things and you make these small adjustments, the reaction is so well received, I promise you.